This video contains major spoilers for Metroid Dread. Metroid Dread is a game that shouldn't exist. And it doesn't just exist, it excels. Dread is the revival of one of the most influential series in gaming and uses that foundation to build new and creative ideas and mechanics. I'm Ouroboros. Let's talk. Dread was never meant to release on the Switch. In fact, it was meant to release roughly 15 years ago on the DS. There's data logs in Metroid Prime 3 that hint to the game saying that Project Dread is nearing completion. Obviously, it never came to fruition. Series creator Yoshio Sakamoto claimed that he couldn't make his vision work on the DS's limited hardware, and so the project was scrapped. Then, Metroid entered its most recent hiatus. From 2002 to 2009, 6 mainline Metroid titles were released: the Prime Trilogy, Hunters, Fusion, and Zero Mission, a remake of the original. From 2010 to 2017, 1 mainline Metroid game was released: Other M, which the entire community hated. I won't get into specifics because there are entire videos dedicated to that, but it messed with the Metroid formula and did an awful job of characterizing Samus in her first game with dialogue. Nintendo thought it would be a great idea to release a spin-off in 2016 that was a co-op shooter. Needless to say, it also failed miserably. Then, the revival. 2017 saw the announcement of 2 mainline Metroid titles: Metroid Prime 4 and Samus Returns, a remake of Metroid 2. As of June 2023, Prime 4 is still in development, and we haven't had any other news since the development restarted in January of 2019. While it was nice to get Samus Returns, there still wasn't a new 2D Metroid since Fusion in 2002 for the Game Boy Advance. That all changed in October of 2021. Metroid Dread finally released with the original name and vision, and also took place at the end of the Metroid timeline. Again, something we hadn't seen since Fusion. Metroid Dread has to be the most important game in the series since Prime 1. Dread starts similarly to other Metroid games. You are given a reason to go to an area, and you're stripped of your abilities. However, the reasons are quite different here. There's no distress beacon, you're not being tasked to hunt down Metroids and destroy the space pirates, there aren't even any Metroids in Dread. The Galactic Federation received a video of a living X-Parasite, which were first encountered in Metroid Fusion. The X can take over their host and are able to rapidly reproduce. Fearing this, the Federation sends a group of EMI, the Extraplanetary Multiform Mobile Identifier, to planet ZDR in order to investigate. After all contact is lost with them, Samus picks up the bounty and heads to ZDR. Her ship AI, Adam, makes note that the bounty for this mission is not large, and that the risk greatly outweighs the reward. Ignoring this, Samus makes her way to the surface, only to be attacked by a Chozo warrior, Ravenbeak. After being stripped of her upgrades and seemingly left for dead, Samus decides that there is no better option than to explore the depths of ZDR and find answers she's been looking for. Dread does a great job of setting things up. It's a relatively brief introductory cutscene. It only lasts about 10 or so minutes, but it immediately sets up the stakes of the narrative. Despite not being present in the opening, the X are clearly going to become an issue later down the line. However, Ravenbeak is the immediate threat. He easily overpowers Samus in the opening, and it's apparent that he's on a different level. I really like that a lot of the attacks that he uses in the cutscene are exactly the same as the ones he uses in his fight at the end of the game. I personally think he's one of the best villains in the series. Obviously, we've had rival-like antagonists before, like Dark Samus and the SAX, but we've never seen a live Chozo before. I don't know if it's ever been directly stated, but I think we all just assumed they were extinct by this point. And this raises an interesting question. Samus was raised by the Chozo and endowed with their gifts, so why attack her? Shouldn't these two be working together? These questions are in the back of your mind until you meet Quiet Robe. There's such an awesome contrast in their introductions. Samus is wary of both, arm cannon at the ready, but instead of making the first strike like Ravenbeak, Quiet Robe simply bows. Samus lowers her arm cannon, realizing that there's no threat. I like the backstory that Quiet Robe gives. It gives quite a lot of insight into the Chozo culture. They're not one singular, unified race, but rather a collection of tribes. I was pretty surprised when I saw this because when we think of advanced races, we tend to think of a homogenous culture. Not only that, but we also see the brutality of the Makan tribe on display in one of the Chozo archives. They're literally forcing the Thoha to be eaten alive. This brutal savagery is in stark contrast to the picture that I've personally built up of the Chozo, one of a proud and elegant species. And then, the best moment in the game. Samus talks. Ignoring other M, this is really the first time Samus has had actual dialogue outside of grunts and screams, and it's perfect. I love that she speaks in Chozo. I love the implication that this is the ending for the Metroid species, and it's one of the most understated parts of the game, maybe even the entire series. Of course, there's another part where Samus talks, kind of. The moment where she goes full, Metroid is awesome. And that visceral scream is spectacular. This is how you do a silent protagonist. I absolutely love Samus in this game. She's always been cool in the past, but Mercury Steam made her an absolute badass. Even pretty early on, you can tell that they communicated so much about Samus through just her body language. Take the ending of the Corpius fight, for example. The way she just glares at the Corpius as it flails, charges her arm cannon, and slowly raises it up for the finishing blow is incredible. And the camera work goes a long way to sell this. You see the Corpius struggling, and then the focus shifts onto Samus with her head tilted down as if this thing is beneath her. As the creature regains its composure, it comes back into focus. The final charge shows both in focus, as Samus is framed by the Corpius' tail. She never looks back. She knows it's dead. And the coup de grace is the platform falling on top of it. Mercury Steam did a great job of conveying that Samus is just done with this. She's tired of the Metroids, and she's tired of cleaning up after the Federation. She's characterized very similarly in the Kraid fight. She's on guard when she first encounters him, but takes one simple step back once she realizes that he's restrained. If you slow down the cutscene, you can see that this one step was enough to put her just outside of Kraid's reach. My favorite part about this sequence is definitely the sidestep when she dodges Kraid's spike at the end and proceeds to lifelessly stare him down as he slowly sinks to his death. Again, Mercury Steam made Samus an unbelievable badass in this game solely through her body language. I feel like they probably took inspiration from Master Chief. Yes, she's still really stoic and potent, but there's enough dynamic flashiness to put you on the edge of your seat and screaming like a child on your couch. I also love Samus's redesign in the game. I always thought the fusion suit looked a little off. Teal, yellow, and red is not exactly a color combination for success. But the revised power suit looks excellent. It still has that biological feel to it. There are these fiber-esque parts running along the length of the suit, and I like the luminescent green accents. I also finally like the gravity suit. It was usually just a palette swap, but there are enough subtle differences in Dread that it finally feels unique. In terms of gameplay, Samus feels the best she ever has. She's so fluid and dynamic in this game. I love the addition of the slide. It's such a small change, but it goes a long way to make traversal more fun. One of my absolute favorite parts of Dread is the speed booster. Particularly the speed booster and the Shine Spark puzzles. The fluidity of movement only accentuated how awesome these puzzles are, and Mercury Steam made some massive changes to help foster more challenging puzzles. You can now maintain the speed booster through a slide and wall jump, and even Shine Spark into a slope to maintain the speed booster. All of these culminate to give Dread some insane puzzles that take dozens of attempts. And it also gives Dread one of the highest skill ceilings in any Metroid game. Of course, we can't talk about skill ceilings without talking about everybody's favorite part of Metroid, the sequence breaks. For those who don't know, sequence breaking refers to obtaining items outside of the intended order. This, along with speedrunning, has been a major part of the Metroid community since Super Metroid. Well, Mercury Steam was clearly aware of this because they threw in some treats for those who are able to successfully break the game. I got the grapple beam and bomb early, so I was able to skip phase 2 of the Kraid fight. And this isn't some exploit. Mercury Steam gives you a morph ball talent to bomb Kraid and completely skip the second half of the fight. I wasn't able to pull this off, but if you're able to Shine Spark into experiment number Z57, you'll also be able to skip part of that fight. These are all great rewards for fully understanding the game's mechanics, and I can't remember the last time a dev has gone out of their way to encourage players to break their game. I know some people aren't the biggest fan of the melee counter, but I enjoy it. I think the risk-reward ratio is a little skewed, though. The timing window is really lenient, and the payoff is always massive, but it does help aid in exploration. You no longer have to slowly gun down basic enemies in your way. One quick dash counter and a few shots, and you're good to keep moving. I think if Mercury Steam had shrunk the counter window on harder difficulties, that would have balanced it out nicely. It's a little jarring to take a ton of damage from low-level enemies, only to annihilate them with a single counter. Another controversial addition is the quick time events in the boss fights. You're given a handful of opportunities to counter a boss, and successfully landing one will trigger an interactive cutscene that leads to a big punish. I really enjoy these. They're pretty few and far between, and you're probably not going to successfully land one on your first go, so it rewards player skill and pattern recognition within the boss fights. Speaking of the bosses, they are so good in Dread, and surprisingly challenging. Keep in mind, when I went back to play Dread for this review, it was my 4th time playing it, and there were still plenty of times when I died to a boss. There's also a nice mixture of puzzle and combat bosses here. Dragaga, I think that's how you say it, is a good example. It's slower paced and more methodical. It's a nice contrast to some of the previous bosses. My favorite is definitely the Ravenbeak fight. He's tough as nails, and it's a long fight. You're probably going to die a bunch of times here, even if you're a Metroid veteran. He uses such a wide range of attacks, but they're all heavily telegraphed, so each death gets you closer to beating him. Even if you don't get as far, you learn more information. When to run, when to shoot, when to use your power bombs, when to counter. It's a high-octane fight that forces you to adapt on the fly. I also really like how Ravenbeak switches between a vertical and a horizontal beam in the counter cutscenes. It shows that he's adapting to Samus and not some pushover. He even goes so far as to tear off his remaining wing after Phase 2. The music here is also great. There are a handful of mini-bosses that overstay their welcome a bit. The robot Chozo soldiers and the Chozo warriors are a little too frequent towards the end of the game. They're both really awesome fights the first time or two, and the fights do evolve as you progress, but they don't change enough to warrant fighting them so many times. However, the real stars here are the Emmys. I love the Emmys. Metroid has always had some horror elements to it, but Mercury Steam really amped it up here. They are terrifying. The Emmy zones are spread out throughout the map, but they don't take up a majority of it. So, while there are plenty of tense sections while you're trying to make it across numerous rooms without being spotted, they're broken up enough to not overwhelm you. They're oppressive, not overwhelming. Mercury Steam did a great job of balancing this out. Of course, as you become more powerful, so do they. By the end, they can literally freeze you through walls. By the end of Dread, Samus has so many broken upgrades that there's basically nothing that can stop her outside of bosses. So seeing an enemy that is equally, if not more powerful, was really refreshing. And they're really smart, and really fast, and really brutal. The counter timing is insanely strict. I honestly don't think it's reactable. It's so tight that you basically have to predict it. Fortunately, they have a set number of patterns. As you die, you'll learn that the first window will correspond to the second window. This gives you just enough hope to continue attempting the counter. However, you'll probably fail it. Over and over and over again. I'm glad they made the Emmys so brutal. If the timing wasn't strict, you wouldn't have to worry about getting caught. Thankfully, the game autosaves immediately before entering an Emmy zone, so you won't have to worry about dying far away from a save station. Your controller will also vibrate like a beating heart if you're hiding from one with the Phantom Cloak. The charge beam doors are also a really nice touch. It's always really frantic when you get spotted, and seeing your shots bounce off a charge beam door creates so much extra tension. And the music goes a long way to sell this. It reminds me a lot of the Guardian theme from Breath of the Wild. While I like this and the Ravenbeak theme, I'm not a very big fan of the sound design in this game. Which is a real shame because I feel like it's one of the few things that this game doesn't excel at. The biggest issue I have comes from Samus's arm cannon. There's no weight to these shots. Just look at the second Emmy encounter. Even the missile just feels weak. I also can't remember the melody to any of the music tracks off the top of my head. I think it's great that a lot of the tracks are super atmospheric and they definitely add to the feel of the game, but they need to be contrasted with some type of melody. Sticking with the Breath of the Wild comparison, the small musical bits here and there were really sparse when just exploring, but there are so many memorable tunes. Rito Village, Attacking Divine Beast Varuto, Hyrule Castle, Calamity Ganon, Dark Beast Ganon, and so many more. I wish Dread had just a handful of tracks like this. The music does complement the world though, and ZDR is such a joy to explore. I really love the environmental puzzles in this game. I always enjoy redirecting the flow when you arrive in Cataris, and finding my way through the maze of one-way doors in Gavorin. However, unlike past games, this world feels like one that evolves with you. I think the best example is when Artaria freezes over. You have to backtrack through the first area in the game, but all the water has now turned to ice, and a lot of old areas are now inaccessible. As you make your way back to Cataris, you'll come across this room which previously had this cool lava vortex, but now it's gone. This is, of course, due to experiment number Z57 being reanimated by a powerful X-Parasite. The experiment was foreshadowed way back in Dairon early game, and its fight does not disappoint. Another example is when the X-Parasites are released into the wild. It's a big turning point in the game both narratively and mechanically. X-infested enemies are stronger than before, and you've inadvertently caused a major ecological disaster. I also really like the mini escape sequence right before you get the Varia suit. Obviously, Metroid is no stranger to escape sequences, but those usually come at the very beginning or very end of the game, so to see one of these right in the middle of Dread was a very welcome surprise. One way Mercury Steam combats backtracking in Dread is the use of one-way doors. Throughout a lot of the game, you'll come across points that you can enter but not return, whether it's a tunnel that you need the morph ball to return to, or a wall that you need the diffusion beam for. Mercury Steam uses these to help guide you in the right direction. You'll probably notice that, unlike past titles, you don't really get lost much in Dread. That's because these tricky one-way doors artificially cut down in the explorable size of the map. In addition, a lot of upgrades are placed next to teleporters that will warp you close to your next upgrade. Game Maker's Toolkit made a really awesome video on this that you should definitely check out. I'll link it in the description. I think this is fine, but I would prefer it to not be so plentiful. They should have allowed the player to get lost just a little more. After all, Metroidvanias are designed around getting lost and finding the correct path. This philosophy is more of a pseudo-linear style, where you think you're finding the correct path, when really the developers are just tricking you into thinking that. I think taking a few ideas from Prime 1's playbook would have been beneficial. Placing very obvious roadblocks so that when you do get that upgrade you've been hunting for, you can connect the dots and remember where to return to. I think part of the problem is that there aren't a ton of memorable rooms in Dread. Yeah, you've got a few standouts here and there, but because of the nature of 2D Metroid and because of the speed at which you travel, it's hard to commit them to memory. You remember the layout of the room rather than the details. Which is really a shame, because if you take still frames of most of the rooms, they're really detailed. I think this 2.5D style is really charming, and I'm constantly amazed at how much they put into the background. On another note, I really like the transitions between cutscene to gameplay. They're super smooth and very seamless. However, the cutscenes are rendered in 30 FPS, and the game runs at 60. It can be jarring to see the game swap between these frame rates because it runs so smoothly otherwise. The last thing I want to touch on is Adam. I don't like him. He just doesn't feel necessary. Yes, it's technically Ravenbeak the whole time, but a lot of his dialogue is redundant. Take, for example, when you get the Phantom Cloak. You fought the boss and read the description when you get the item, so you already know how it works. Then you see Samus use it against an Emmy in a cutscene. Adam still explains it to you the next time you see him. I don't understand why this was needed, especially in a Metroid game. It's not enough to be offensive, but small moments like this can add up to be really irritating. The only thing I like about him is the subtle hint that it was Ravenbeak all along. Adam always calls Samus Lady, but Ravenbeak only refers to Samus as Samus. It's a small detail, but a really cool one to note. Metroid Dread is awesome. It really is. It's not perfect, but I think it's exactly what Metroid needed. It marks the true revival of a series most of us thought was dormant. While I think some aspects of it are a little hit or miss, it offers a stellar Metroidvania adventure. I think the story is present and deep enough to bring in new fans, but it won't isolate the existing fan base because it isn't omnipresent. The game mechanics are superb. Samus has never felt better to control, and the speed booster puzzles are incredible and will always leave a smile on your face. The world is vibrant and dynamic, though not overwhelming. I think Dread slightly understays its welcome. It's clear that the game was a little rushed. The overuse of certain boss fights and obvious cuts of others is apparent. I also wish it could have spent more time developing some of the newer upgrades. Though what we are given is definitely quality content. Samus is an absolute badass in Dread, and the gameplay supports that. It's the first step into a new Metroid era, and I encourage each and every one of you to play, complete, and break the game. Thanks for watching.